The heavy scent of rain-dampened stone and wilting lilies always reminds me of the day my life was signed away over a cold mahogany table. It was a Tuesday, a day of no particular importance to the world, but for me, it was the end of everything I had ever known. My father, a man whose pride had been eroded by gambling debts and failed investments, refused to look me in the eye. He sat by the window of our crumbling estate, the late afternoon sun casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. My mother stood behind him, her face a mask of practiced indifference, though I could see the way her fingers trembled as she smoothed the lace of her apron. The silence in the room was louder than any shout, a suffocating weight that pressed the air from my lungs. Then came the words that shattered my universe. "You are to marry the Viscount of Blackwood," my father said, his voice thin and raspy. "The arrangements are finalized." I remember laughing, a short, hysterical sound that died quickly in the gloom. The Viscount of Blackwood? He was a legend of misery, a man whispered about in the village as a ghost who refused to haunt the graveyard. They said he was 80 years old, a withered husk of a man who had not left his ancestral home in 3 decades. Some claimed he was so fragile that a strong wind would snap his bones, others said he was so riddled with pox and age that he wore a veil to keep from frightening the servants. "He is dying," Clara, my mother added, her voice a soft, desperate plea. "He has no heirs, and he needs a wife to manage the estate in his final months. In exchange, he has agreed to clear every penny of our debt. You will be a widow before the year is out, and you will be the wealthiest woman in the county. You are not just marrying a man, you are saving this family from the workhouse." I looked at the peeling wallpaper and the empty spaces where our portraits used to hang, sold off one by one to pay for my father's distractions. I was 22 years old, full of dreams about a love that felt like summer lightning, and now I was being sold to a tomb. I spent the next 2 weeks in a trance. There was no celebration, no fitting for a grand gown. Instead, I packed my life into 2 small trunks while the rain lashed against my window, mirroring the tears I refused to shed in front of my parents. I thought of the young baker's son who used to bring me extra tarts, and the way the blacksmith's apprentice would linger at our gate just to see me smile. All of that was gone now. I was no longer a woman, I was a transaction. The journey to Blackwood Manor took 3 days. As the carriage moved further north, the lush green hills of my childhood gave way to jagged cliffs and gray, unforgiving moors. The air turned sharp and cold, smelling of salt and ancient earth. Blackwood Manor rose out of the mist like a jagged tooth. It was a fortress of black stone, surrounded by gnarled trees that looked like reaching hands. There were no flowers in the gardens, only ivy that clung to the walls like a suffocating shroud. When the carriage door opened, a butler as stiff and gray as the house itself met me. He didn't smile. He didn't welcome me. He simply took my bags and led me inside. The interior of the manor was a labyrinth of shadow. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the daylight, and the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks, all seemingly out of sync. It felt as though time itself had become trapped here, circling endlessly in the dark. I was told the Viscount was too weak to greet me. He remained in the West Wing, a place of medicinal smells and hushed whispers. My days were spent in a state of quiet dread. I wandered the dusty library, reading books with cracked spines, and ate my meals alone in a dining hall large enough to host a ball. Every time I asked about my future husband, the servants would look away, their faces pale. "He is preparing," they would say. "He is gathering his strength for the ceremony." The wedding was set for a moonless Friday. I was dressed in a gown of heavy ivory silk that felt like lead against my skin. There were no guests. No music. Just the cold, echoing silence of the Manor's private chapel. My father had arrived that morning, looking smaller and more broken than ever, avoiding my gaze as he led me down the aisle. The chapel was lit by a forest of black candles, their flames dancing in the draught. And there, at the altar, stood the man I had been sold to. He was a terrifying sight. He was draped in heavy, dark robes that seemed to swallow his frame, making him look hunched and fragile. A thick black mask covered his entire face, and a hood was pulled low over his brow. He leaned heavily on a silver-topped cane, his gloved hands shaking with a visible tremor. As I reached his side, I could hear his breathing, a wet, labored rasp that echoed off the stone walls. It was the sound of a man standing on the very edge of the grave. I felt a wave of profound pity wash over me, momentarily drowning out my anger. This wasn't a monster, it was a dying flame. The priest began the ceremony in a low, somber drone. Each word felt like a nail in a coffin. When it came time for the vows, my voice was a mere whisper, a hollow I do that felt like a betrayal of my soul. Then, it was his turn. The priest leaned in close to the masked figure. The Viscount's voice was a low, guttural croak, barely audible, as he repeated the words. It was over. I was the Viscountess of Blackwood, bound to a dying man in a house of secrets. The ring, the priest prompted. The Viscount reached out, his movements slow and agonizing. But as he took my hand to slide the cold gold band onto my finger, something changed. His grip was not the weak, trembling touch of an 80-year-old man. His fingers were long, steady, and possessed a sudden, terrifying strength. I gasped, looking up at the mask. The wet, labored breathing had stopped. Suddenly, with a violent, fluid motion that sent the silver cane clattering across the stone floor, the man at the altar straightened. He grew several inches, his shoulders broadening as he shed the persona of a cripple. He reached up with both hands and tore the black mask from his face, throwing it to the ground. I stopped breathing. The man standing before me was not 80. He was not dying. He was perhaps 32 years old, with a face carved from granite and eyes the color of a stormy sea. His dark hair fell across a forehead that bore no wrinkles of age, and his jaw was set in a line of fierce, cold determination. He was handsome in a way that felt dangerous, like a wolf dressed in silk. My name is Julian Thorne, he said, his voice now a deep, resonant baritone that filled the chapel, vibrating in the very marrow of my bones. I am the Viscount of Blackwood. And I believe we have much to discuss, my wife. The world tilted on its axis. My father let out a choked sound of terror, and the priest nearly dropped the Bible. I looked at the mask on the floor, then back at the man who had lied to the entire world, and to me. I had been prepared to be a nurse to a dying man. I was not prepared for the fire that was currently burning in Julian Thorne's eyes. This was not an end. It was a beginning I wasn't sure I would survive. The chapel felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of it, replaced by a cold, electric tension. I stared at Julian Thorne, my mind racing to reconcile the image of the trembling old man with the powerful, vibrant figure now looming over me. My father made a hasty, panicked exit, his footsteps echoing like a coward's drumbeat against the flagstones. He had his money, he no longer cared what kind of beast he had left me with. I turned back to my husband, a word that felt like a brand on my skin. Why the charade? I demanded, my voice trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning, hot-blooded rage. Why the mask, the cane, the whispers of death? Julian didn't answer immediately. He watched me with a calculating intensity, as if he were memorizing the way my anger made my eyes spark. "I needed to know who would be loyal to a dying man," he said finally, his voice devoid of any warmth. "People show their true faces when they believe the end is near. They reveal their greed, their betrayals, and their secrets. I had to ensure my wife was someone who came to me out of a sense of duty or desperation, not someone looking to climb a social ladder that was about to collapse." I glared at him, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "So I was a test? A pawn in your game of shadows?" He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and rain clinging to him, far removed from the medicinal stench that had filled the West Wing. "You were a necessity, Clara. Blackwood is a house under siege, though the walls are still standing." He led me out of the chapel, not toward the celebratory feast one might expect, but toward the dark heart of the manor. The servants we passed bowed low, their faces showing no surprise. They had been in on it. Every whispered warning, every look of pity they had given me over the last 2 weeks had been a choreographed lie. We reached his study, a room lined with leather-bound books and heavy with the scent of old paper. A fire roared in the hearth, but it did little to thaw the ice in my chest. "You will have your own rooms in the East Wing," he told me, standing behind a desk cluttered with ledgers and maps. "We will share meals when I am not occupied. Beyond that, your life is your own, provided you do not cross into the West Wing without my permission." The following weeks were a blur of isolation and silent discovery. Julian was a ghost in his own home, appearing only at dinner, where he remained as silent as the stone statues in the hallway. I began to explore the manor, finding beauty in its decay. I found a sun-drenched morning room with a piano that hadn't been tuned in a decade, and a conservatory where the glass was cracked but the ferns still grew wild and green. I also found the secrets. I discovered that Julian's father and older brother had died in a carriage accident 3 years ago, an accident the village whispered was no accident at all. I found letters in the library from a man named Silas Vane, a cousin who claimed Julian was unfit for the title and threatened to expose the truth of that fatal night. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, I confronted Julian during dinner. "The village says your family was murdered," I said, dropping my fork onto the fine china with a sharp clatter. "They say you are hiding because you are afraid of the same fate." Julian's hand stopped mid-air, his wineglass reflecting the flickering candlelight. "The village talks because they have nothing better to do than weave ghost stories," he replied coldly. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Was it pain or guilt? "I am not hiding, Clara. I am preparing." "For what?" I asked, leaning forward. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment the wall of ice between us cracked. "For the day Silas Vane decides to finish what he started." That night, I was awakened by a sound, a low, rhythmic thudding coming from the West Wing. It sounded like someone hammering, or perhaps a struggle. Ignoring Julian's warning, I grabbed a candle and crept through the drafty corridors. The West Wing was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with dust. I followed the sound to a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I found not a sick room, but a workshop. The walls were covered in intricate mechanical drawings and strange, brass-geared devices. In the center of the room, Julian stood over a table, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat glistening on his brow as he worked on a complex lock. He spun around as I entered, his expression fierce. "I told you never to come here," he hissed. I didn't listen, I countered, stepping into the room. What is this, Julian? He sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders. This is the truth of Blackwood. My father wasn't just a viscount, he was an inventor. He held patents that Silas Vane wants to steal. Patents that could change the way the world uses steam and steel. He was murdered for these designs, and I have spent the last 3 years perfecting them and building a security that no one can break. The mask, the dying act, it was all to buy me time. If Silas thought I was a threat, he would have killed me years ago. But he thinks I am a rotting corpse, and so he waits. I looked at the drawings, the brilliance of the designs taking my breath away. You've been living in a cage to protect a ghost's legacy, I whispered. He walked toward me, his presence overwhelming in the small room. It's not just a legacy, Clara. It's the future. And now, you are part of it. Whether you like it or not, Silas knows I've married. He will come to see if the new Viscountess is a weakness he can exploit. I realized then that my marriage wasn't just a financial transaction for my father, it was a death sentence or a triumph for Julian. We stood there in the candlelight, a man obsessed with the past and a woman terrified of the future, bound together by a lie that was rapidly becoming our only reality. The next morning, a carriage arrived at the gates. It wasn't my parents or a friendly neighbor. It was Silas Vane. He was a man of sharp angles and even sharper smiles, his eyes wandering over the manor as if he were already measuring it for new curtains. Julian donned his mask once more, leaning on his cane as he met Silas in the drawing room. I stood by his side, playing the role of the grieving, dutiful wife. Silas looked at me with a predatory hunger. A beautiful young bride for a man with one foot in the grave, he mused, his voice like oil on silk. Tell me, Lady Blackwood, does your husband speak to you, or does he only rattle his chains? I felt Julian's hand tighten on my arm, a silent command for restraint. My husband is a man of many depths, Mr. Vane, I replied, meeting his gaze. More than you could possibly imagine. Silas stayed for 3 days, and each hour was a game of cat and mouse. He searched for the workshop, he questioned the servants, and he tried to corner me in the gardens. He told me Julian was a madman who had caused the accident that killed his family. He showed me a forged document claiming the estate was rightfully his. I felt the web of lies tightening around us. On the final night of his visit, Silas cornered me in the library. Leave him, Clara, he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. He is a dead man walking. Come with me, and you will have a life of light, not this tomb. I looked at the door, where I saw a shadow move. Julian was watching. This was the moment. The choice I made now would decide which version of the Viscount lived, and which one died. The library was thick with the scent of old parchment and the predatory musk of Silas Vane's cologne. His offer hung in the air like a poisoned lure, a life of light, he called it, away from the shadows of Blackwood. I could see the silhouette of Julian in the doorway, a dark statue waiting to see if his investment in me would pay off or if I would crumble like everyone else in his life. I looked Silas directly in his cold, calculating eyes and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. You speak of light, Mr. Vane, but you carry the shadow of a thief, I said, my voice projecting with a strength that surprised even me. My husband may be a man of secrets, but he is a man of honor. You are merely a man of appetite. The charm slid off Silas's face like melting wax, revealing a sneer of pure malice. You are a fool, little bird, he hissed, stepping back. You've chosen to nest in a burning house. He turned and stormed out, nearly brushing against Julian, who remained perfectly still in the darkness. When Silas's footsteps faded, Julian stepped into the light of the single candle I held. His mask was off, and for the first time, his expression wasn't one of suspicion or calculation. It was something closer to awe. "You defended me," he whispered, as if the concept was foreign to his tongue. "I defended the truth," I replied, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "But he is not going to leave, Julian. He knows there is something in this house he hasn't found yet." Julian nodded, his jaw tight. "He knows about the workshop. He's been tracking the shipments of brass and mercury for months." That night, the manor felt more like a battlefield than a home. Julian stayed in the west wing, the sound of his tools clinking against metal echoing through the vents. I sat in the morning room, unable to sleep, watching the fog roll off the moors. I realized then that I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I was an accomplice. I spent the night memorizing the layout of the corridors, the creaks of the floorboards, and the heavy iron keys Julian had entrusted to me. If Silas was the hunter, he was about to find that the prey had grown teeth. The storm broke on the third night. Thunder shook the black stone walls, and the rain turned the grounds into a muddy quagmire. I was in the library when the front door was thrown open with such force that the hinges groaned. Silas had returned, and he wasn't alone. He had brought 3 men with him, rough, desperate-looking characters with lanterns and heavy clubs. "Where is he?" Silas roared, his voice echoing up the grand staircase. "Where is the dying Viscount and his precious workshop?" I stood at the top of the stairs, my ivory silk gown shimmering in the lightning flashes. "My husband is resting," I said calmly. "And you are trespassing." Silas laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. "The play is over, Clara. I know Julian is a fraud. I know he's been hiding in that wing like a coward while I've been doing the real work of the family name. Move aside, or my men will move you." I didn't move. Instead, I pulled a small, brass device from my pocket, something Julian had given me just hours before. It was a whistle, but not for sound. As I blew into it, a series of hidden latches in the hallway clicked. Heavy iron grills dropped from the ceiling, sealing off the main corridors. Silas and his men were trapped in the foyer, their lanterns casting frantic shadows against the bars. "What devilry is this?" Silas screamed, striking the iron with his club. "It's not devilry, Mr. Vane," I said, descending the stairs slowly until I was just out of his reach. "It's the future." "You wanted the Blackwood inventions? Well, you are currently experiencing one." From the shadows behind me, Julian emerged. He wasn't wearing the mask. He was dressed in black leather, a heavy pistol at his side, looking every bit the warrior-inventor he had become. "You killed my father for a dream you couldn't understand," Julian said, his voice like grinding stones. "You thought age and illness were my only defenses. You forgot that the mind is the sharpest blade." Silas's face went pale as he looked at the man he thought was a corpse. "Julian, you're supposed to be rotting." "I am very much alive," Julian replied, stepping toward the bars. "And I have spent every day of the last 3 years documenting your crimes. The letters you sent, the men you hired to sabotage the carriage, I have it all. And now, I have witnesses." He gestured to the shadows, where the gray-haired butler and 2 other servants stepped forward, holding rifles. The law is on its way, Silas. The moors are a lonely place, but the Queen's men still find their way here eventually. The realization hit Silas like a physical blow. He lunged at the bars, his fingers clawing at the air. I'll burn this place down. I'll take you both with me. But Julian simply turned a dial on the wall. A low, vibrating hum filled the room, and the air around the foyer began to glow with a faint, blue light. It was a demonstration of the power Julian had been perfecting, a static barrier that made the men's hair stand on end and their lanterns flicker out. They fell to their knees in terror, convinced they were facing sorcery. As the authorities arrived and dragged Silas and his men into the night, the manor grew quiet once more. The heavy grills were raised, and the blue glow faded. Julian stood in the center of the foyer, looking exhausted, his shoulders finally dropping the weight of a 3-year war. He looked at me, and for the first time, he reached out and took my hand. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his voice low and vulnerable. "You could have run when the grills dropped. You could have been free of all of this." I looked around the dark, beautiful, and broken house that was now mine. "I didn't marry a dying old man, Julian," I said, stepping into his arms. "I married a man who was too busy building the future to live in the present. I stayed because I wanted to see what happens when the sun finally rises over Blackwood." He leaned down and kissed me then, not a kiss of duty or desperation, but a kiss of promise. The deception was over, the mask was gone, and the real Julian Thorne was finally standing in the light. But as we looked toward the west wing, we both knew that while Silas was gone, the secrets of Blackwood were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The world would soon want what Julian had built, and we would have to face that storm together. The dawn that followed Silas Vane's arrest was unlike any other I had seen at Blackwood. The fog, which usually clung to the moors like a heavy wool blanket, began to burn away under a pale, golden sun. Inside the manor, the air felt lighter, as if the house itself had taken a long overdue breath. Julian did not return to his mask or his cane. He spent the morning in the workshop, but the doors were no longer locked. When I entered, I found him not hunched over a desk in desperation, but standing by the window, watching the horizon. He turned to me, and the hardness in his eyes had softened into something resembling peace. "It's over," he said softly. "The documentation I gave the constables will keep Silas behind bars for the rest of his miserable life. The patents are safe. Blackwood is safe." But I realized that safety was a new and frightening concept for a man who had lived as a ghost for 3 years. Our marriage, which had begun as a desperate gamble for my family and a strategic play for his, was now a blank canvas. We spent the spring months transforming the manor. The heavy velvet curtains were replaced with light linens that danced in the breeze. The gardens, once a graveyard of weeds and stone, began to bloom with roses and lavender as I hired local villagers to help restore the grounds. Julian, too, began to change. He stepped out of the shadows of the West Wing and into the life of the village. He used his father's inventions to bring clean water to the local farms and invested in the crumbling schoolhouse. The people who had once whispered he was a monster now tipped their hats to him with genuine respect. One afternoon, my parents arrived for a visit. My father looked healthy, his debts paid and his dignity restored by Julian's generosity. My mother wept when she saw me, not out of the guilt that had once consumed her, but because she saw the glow in my cheeks and the way I walked through Blackwood with the authority of a woman who was truly loved. She pulled me aside in the garden. "Can you ever forgive us, Clara?" she asked. For selling you to what we thought was a tomb? I looked at Julian, who was currently showing my father a mechanical model of a steam engine, his face animated and bright. I didn't marry a tomb, Mother, I told her. I married a man who was waiting for someone to remind him he was still alive. You didn't sell me, you sent me exactly where I needed to be. As the months turned into a year, the mystery of Julian's death became a story we told by the fire, a legend of the past rather than a haunting of the present. One evening, on the anniversary of our wedding, Julian took me back to the small chapel. It was no longer filled with black candles and dread. Instead, it was filled with the scent of fresh wildflowers. He took my hand, his grip steady and warm. "A year ago, I stood here and lied to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I gave you a name that wasn't mine and a future that felt like a prison. Tonight, I want to give you the truth." He knelt before me, not as a viscount or an inventor, but simply as a man. "Clara, I didn't just need a wife to protect my secrets. I needed you to save my soul. I love you, not as a partner in a game, but as the heart of my life. Will you marry me again, for real this time?" I pulled him up and kissed him, the joy bubbling in my chest. "I have been your wife in every way that matters since the moment you tore off that mask," I whispered. "But yes, Julian. 1,000 times, yes. We didn't need a priest or a ceremony to tell us what we already knew. Our marriage had been forged in the fire of deception and tempered by the steel of shared danger. It was stronger than any tradition." Years passed, and the sounds of laughter eventually filled the halls of Blackwood. A nursery was established in the East Wing, and the ticking clocks that once sounded like a countdown to death now felt like the steady heartbeat of a growing family. Julian's inventions changed the world, but he always said his greatest discovery was the strength of the woman who stood by him when he had nothing but a mask and a cane. I often think back to that Tuesday morning at my father's table, the day I thought my life was ending. I was a girl who was sold to a dying man, but I became a woman who lived for a king. Our story didn't end with a tragedy or a funeral. It ended with the sun rising over the moors, shining on a house that was no longer a fortress of secrets, but a home built on the most powerful invention of all, a love that refused to die. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support means the world.